two crowds are walking toward each other on a dirt road in ancient Galilee. One crowd is loud. They are full of anticipation. They are following a young rabbi who has just healed a Roman centurion's servant, without even stepping foot inside the man's house. They have seen miracles. They have heard teaching unlike anything the religious leaders have ever offered. This crowd is expanding, full of energy, and moving with the momentum of life. The other crowd is weeping. They are moving slowly, burdened by a terrible weight. They are not following a healer. They are following a corpse. It is a funeral procession, carrying the body of a young man out of his hometown to be buried in the rocky tombs beyond the city walls. These two crowds are entirely different. One represents the sudden, explosive arrival of the kingdom of God. The other represents the ancient, unbroken curse of human death, and they are about to collide. The Gospel of Luke records this moment in Luke chapter 7, verses 11 and 12. It says that soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out. Notice the geography of the scene. In the ancient world, the city gate was a choke point. It was the narrow threshold where the inside of the city met the outside world. It was where business was done, where elders sat to judge, and where travelers entered and exited. Because Jewish purity laws required tombs to be placed outside the city, every funeral eventually had to pass through the gate. And it is right there, at that exact threshold, that the two crowds meet. The crowd of life and the crowd of death. They are face to face. The road is narrow. One of these processions is going to have to yield to the other. Normally, the answer was obvious. In the first century, a funeral procession always had the right of way. Death demanded respect. When a body was being carried to the grave, anyone on the road was expected to stop, stand aside, and let the mourners pass. If you were a devout person, you might even join the procession for a short distance to honor the dead. Death was the ultimate interruption. It stopped everything else. But that is not what happens at the gate of Nain. Jesus does not step aside. He does not lower his head and wait for the procession to pass. He does not yield to death. Instead, he steps directly into its path. Most readers see this story simply as a random act of kindness. Jesus is walking. He happens to see a grieving mother. He feels sorry for her, and he uses his power to fix the situation. It is often treated like an isolated incident, a spontaneous miracle. But Luke is doing something much deeper here. He is not just giving us a random piece of historical trivia. He is carefully constructing a narrative that reveals exactly who Jesus is, not just by what he does, but by where he does it. Nothing about this collision is accidental. Not the timing, not the crowd, and certainly not the location. Jesus chose to walk to Nain. But to understand why this moment is so profound, and why the people who witnessed it reacted the way they did, we have to look closely at exactly where Jesus chose to walk that day. He did not pick this town at random. He stepped onto a very specific piece of ground, a place echoing with ancient memory, a detail most modern readers completely miss. To understand the collision at the gate, you have to understand the geography of Galilee. Nain is a small village. It sits on the northern slope of a prominent mountain known as the Hill of Moreh. Even today, it is a steep, rocky climb. Jesus and his disciples had to walk roughly 25 miles from Capernaum to get there. It was not a casual afternoon stroll. It was a deliberate, exhausting journey uphill. But why Nain? To find the answer, you only have to walk over the crest of that same mountain. Just a few miles away, on the southern slope of the Hill of Moreh, sits another ancient village, a village called Shunem. If you lived in first century Israel, you knew the stories of Shunem. The Hill of Moreh was sacred ground, because centuries before Jesus walked up that mountain, another man walked those same rocky paths. His name was Elisha. He was one of the greatest prophets in the history of Israel. And the book of 2 Kings, chapter 4, records a stunning event that took place right there in Shunem. A wealthy woman in the village had a young son. One day, the boy went out to the fields, clutched his head in pain, and died in his mother's arms. She laid his body on a bed and sent for Elisha. When the prophet arrived, he went into the room, shut the door, and prayed. He stretched himself out over the lifeless body of the boy. The boy's flesh grew warm. He sneezed 7 times, and he opened his eyes. Elisha called for the mother and spoke a simple command: "Pick up your son." It was a resurrection, a dead son given back to a weeping mother on the slopes of the Hill of Moreh. Now, hold that ancient story in your mind and fast forward 900 years. Jesus walks up the exact same mountain. He approaches a village just over the ridge from Shunem. And what does he encounter? A grieving mother whose son has died. This is not a coincidence. Luke, the author of the Gospel, is a careful historian. He wants his readers to recognize the echoes. He is showing us that Jesus is deliberately stepping into a prophetic pattern. Jesus is walking in the literal shadow of Elisha. When the crowd traveling with Jesus sees the funeral procession at Nain, they would have known the history of the ground they were standing on. They knew what God had done on this mountain before. The tension in the air must have been electric. The great prophet of the past had defeated death on this hill. What will this new rabbi do? Jesus is placing himself perfectly within the biblical framework. He is drawing a direct line between the ancient prophets and himself. He is showing that the God who acted in the past is acting again, right here, on the exact same stage. But as the two crowds meet at the narrow gate of the city, the situation is actually far worse than the one Elisha faced centuries earlier. The woman in Shunem was wealthy. She had a husband. She had land. She had a safety net. The woman standing in front of Jesus has none of those things. The location proves Jesus is deliberately stepping into an ancient prophetic pattern. But what he encounters at the gate is a tragedy deeper than just physical death. The woman standing in front of Jesus has none of those things. To understand the full weight of the scene at the gate of Nain, we have to look past our modern understanding of grief and step into the brutal economic reality of the ancient Near East. In the 1st century, a woman's survival was tied almost entirely to the men in her family. The social structure was intensely patriarchal. A woman was protected and provided for, first by her father. When she married, that responsibility transferred to her husband. If her husband died, she became a widow, which was one of the most dangerous social categories in the ancient world. The Hebrew Bible constantly commands Israel to defend the fatherless and the widow. The prophets warn against exploiting them. This constant repetition exists for a reason. Without a husband to defend her legal rights, a widow was highly vulnerable to losing her land, her income, and her place in the community. But this woman in Nain still had one lifeline. She had a son. As long as she had a male heir, the family name continued. The family property remained secure. She had someone to work the fields, someone to speak for her in the marketplace, and someone to ensure she would not starve in her old age. Her son was her anchor to the world of the living. Then, Luke drops a devastating detail into the text. In verse 12, he writes, "He was the only son of his mother, and she was a widow." It is a short sentence, but in the 1st century, those words amounted to a death sentence. When that young man's heart stopped beating, the woman's future completely vanished. With no husband and no other sons, her legal and financial connection to society was entirely severed. The family land would likely pass to a distant male relative. She would be reduced to relying on the unpredictable charity of her neighbors. She was facing a future of gleaning the edges of harvest fields, begging at the gates, or slowly starving. This is why the crowd walking with her is so large. Luke specifically notes that a large crowd from the town was with her. They are not just weeping over the premature death of a young man. They are weeping because they are watching the total, irreversible collapse of this woman's life. She is walking behind the wooden board, carrying her son's body. But in the eyes of her culture, she is already a ghost. Death took her husband, death took her son, and very soon poverty and exposure will likely take her. The procession moves slowly toward the burial caves. The dust rises from the road. The musicians play the traditional dirges. The mourners wail loudly, filling the air with the raw, chaotic sound of human despair. It is a scene of absolute, unbroken defeat. And then, the procession abruptly stops. They do not stop because they have reached the tomb. They stop because a young rabbi from Nazareth is standing in the middle of the road, blocking the gate. The crowd of life and the crowd of death are now locked face to face. The loud wailing of the mourners collides with the stunned silence of the disciples. Jesus looks at the mother. He does not see a woman who is simply having a difficult day. He sees a woman who has been entirely consumed by the curse of death. Her life is effectively over. The crowd knows this. Jesus knows this, and his reaction to her reveals something deeply unexpected about the nature of God. Luke chapter 7, verse 13, records exactly what happens the moment Jesus sees the widow. The English translations usually say something like, "He had compassion on her," or "His heart went out to her." Those phrases are gentle. They sound polite. They make it sound like Jesus felt a brief, passing wave of sympathy for a sad situation. But the original language is not polite. It is visceral. The Greek word Luke uses here is splanchnizoomai. It is a heavy, difficult word to pronounce, and an even heavier word to translate. It comes from a root word, splanchna, which literally refers to the inner organs, the intestines, the guts. In the ancient world, people did not usually think of the physical heart as the center of deep emotion. The heart was often seen as the center of thought and decision. The center of deep, uncontrollable emotion was the gut. If you have ever received news so devastating that you physically doubled over, or if you have ever felt a sudden, sharp ache in your stomach when watching someone you love suffer, you understand the root of this ancient word. Splanchnizoomai does not mean a passing feeling of pity. It describes a compassion that is so intense it physically hurts. It is a gut-wrenching, agonizing response to the pain of another person. When Jesus looks at this widow, he does not just notice her grief from a distance. He absorbs it. He feels the destruction of her life in his own physical body. Pause for a second and see what has emerged. So far, this has not been a random set of details. Jesus deliberately walked 25 miles uphill to a mountain loaded with prophetic history. He deliberately met a funeral procession at the narrow gate. And now, the biblical text slows down to show us the exact emotional state of God when he confronts human death. This detail is revolutionary. In the first century, the dominant philosophical idea about the divine was heavily influenced by Greek thought. Many people believed that a perfect divine being had to exist in a state of apatheia. Apathy. The inability to suffer, the inability to be moved by human pain. To be affected by human grief was seen as a weakness. A perfect God was supposed to be a distant, unfeeling observer. But here, standing in the dust at the gate of Nain, the biblical picture of God shatters that idea completely. Jesus, the visible image of the invisible God, is physically moved by the tears of a broken, vulnerable woman. He is not distant. He is not stoic. The author of life looks at the devastation caused by death, and it tears at his core. In fact, throughout the Gospels, this specific Greek verb is used almost exclusively to describe Jesus, or a character in one of Jesus's parables, who represents God. It is the defining emotion of the kingdom of heaven breaking into a broken world. Driven by this gut-wrenching compassion, Jesus steps toward the widow and speaks only 2 words to her. Do not weep. Under normal circumstances, telling a grieving mother not to cry at her only son's funeral would be cruel. It would be dismissive. You cannot just command away grief with words, unless, of course, the person speaking the words has the power to remove the reason for the tears. Jesus is not offering empty comfort. He is issuing a promise. He is about to dismantle the tragedy that is breaking her apart. But to do that, he has to cross a line that no respectable religious teacher in Israel would ever cross. The crowd is watching him closely. They have seen his compassion, but they are entirely unprepared for his next move. Jesus turns away from the weeping mother, and he steps directly toward the wooden board carrying the dead body. He feels her pain at the deepest physical level. But what he does next would have sent a shockwave of scandal through the entire crowd. Jesus turns away from the weeping mother, and he steps directly toward the wooden board carrying the dead body. To modern ears, approaching a coffin is completely normal at a funeral. But in the first-century Jewish world, it was unthinkable, especially for a rabbi. When Jesus reaches out his hand toward the funeral bier, the entire crowd likely gasps. The men carrying the body instantly freeze. To understand the shock of this moment, you have to understand the ancient biblical laws of ritual purity. In the book of Numbers, chapter 19, the law states that whoever touches a human corpse will be unclean for 7 days. In fact, touching a dead body was the highest degree of ritual impurity in the entire biblical system. Ritual impurity was not necessarily a sin. It was a fact of life in a fallen world, but it carried heavy consequences. It meant that you were temporarily restricted from approaching the holy presence of God. You could not go to the temple. You had to undergo a week-long process of washing and waiting before you could be restored to the community. In the biblical worldview, death is not natural. It is an invader. It is the ultimate consequence of humanity's rebellion in the Garden of Eden. And because of that, death was treated as highly contagious. If you touched a dead body, the impurity of death transferred to you. If you touched the bone of a dead person, you became unclean. If you even entered a tent where someone had died, the impurity spread to you. And the law was very specific. Numbers chapter 19 also says that whoever touches anything the dead body is resting on becomes unclean. Luke chapter 7, verse 14, tells us exactly what Jesus did. He went up and touched the bier. The bier was a flat wooden board or stretcher used to carry the body to the tomb. By touching the wood, Jesus is willingly subjecting himself to the highest level of ritual defilement. This is why the procession abruptly stops. The pallbearers know the law. The religious leaders know the law. The disciples know the law. A holy man is supposed to protect his purity. Priests would cross the street to avoid a grave. Pharisees would meticulously wash their hands to avoid accidental contamination from the marketplace. In their minds, holiness is fragile. It must be guarded. It must be kept far away from the corruption of death. But Jesus operates under a completely different reality. He does not pull back from the dead. He reaches out. He bridges the gap. This is a profound theological reversal. For thousands of years, the law of impurity worked in only one direction. If the clean touches the unclean, the clean becomes defiled. The healthy person cannot make the sick person well just by touching them. But the sick person can infect the healthy one. Death is stronger than life. That was the grim reality of the fallen world. But standing at the gate of Nain, Jesus is about to challenge the fundamental mechanics of a broken creation. He is not worried about being infected by death because he knows exactly who he is. He is the author of life. And when the author of life touches death, the flow of contagion reverses. Instead of the impurity of death flowing up into Jesus, the untouchable purity of his life is about to flow down into the darkness. The men carrying the dead body stand perfectly still. The mother is watching. The crowd holds its breath. Under the law, touching the bier should have made Jesus unclean. But instead of death infecting the living, something entirely unprecedented happens. When the men carrying the wooden board stop, the silence on that dirt road must have been absolute. The crowd knows the law of Moses. They expect Jesus to pull his hand back, defiled by the proximity of a corpse. They expect the heavy reality of death to win, just as it always has. Instead, Jesus leaves his hand on the wood, and he speaks. He does not pray. He does not look up to heaven and ask for a miracle. He does not perform a ritual. He simply looks at the dead body and says, "Young man, I say to you, arise." To appreciate the sheer weight of that sentence, we have to look back at the prophets who walked this same mountain centuries earlier. When Elijah raised a widow's son in the book of 1 Kings, he did not just speak. He took the lifeless boy to an upper room. He cried out to God in anguish. He stretched himself out over the body 3 times. He begged God, saying, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." Elijah was a powerful prophet, but he was only a conduit. He had to ask for the power to be given. When Elisha raised the boy in Shunem, just over the ridge from where Jesus is standing, the process was very similar. Elisha went into the room. He shut the door. He prayed to the Lord. He stretched himself over the body. He got up and walked back and forth in the house, pacing, waiting, wrestling in prayer, before stretching over the boy a second time. The ancient prophets fought for the lives of those children through intense, agonizing prayer. They knew they did not hold the keys to death. They could only appeal to the one who did. But Jesus does none of that. He does not pace. He does not plead. He does not shut the door. He does not stretch himself over the body to transfer warmth. He speaks directly to the dead. And notice his phrasing. I say to you, not, the Lord says to you, not, may God grant you life. He speaks with his own inherent authority. In the biblical worldview, there is only one voice that has that kind of direct authority over creation. In the opening pages of Genesis, God speaks into the darkness, and the unformed void obeys. He says, "Let there be light," and light exists. Now, standing at the gate of Nain, the Word made flesh speaks into the darkness of a human grave, and the darkness obeys. Luke chapter 7, verse 15 is one of the most stunning, understated verses in the New Testament. It simply says, "The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother." Just like that, the funeral is ruined, the dirges stop, the wailing ceases. The mourners are suddenly standing around a living, breathing man sitting on a burial stretcher. The unstoppable procession of death has just been completely reversed by a single sentence. And notice the final detail in that verse. Jesus takes the young man and gives him to his mother. That is the exact phrasing used in the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament when Elijah gives the raised boy back to his mother in 1 Kings. The echo is unmistakable. Jesus is finishing the picture. He is showing that he is not just another teacher from Galilee. He is the Lord of life, walking the ancient paths, fulfilling the shadow of the prophets. The young man sits up and speaks. The funeral is ruined, and the crowd's immediate reaction tells us they instantly recognize the ancient pattern playing out before their eyes. When the dead man speaks, the mourning abruptly turns into something completely different. Luke records the immediate reaction of the crowd in chapter 7, verse 16. He writes, "Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, 'A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people.'" Notice the first thing they feel: fear. This is not the panic you feel when you are in danger. This is biblical fear. It is the trembling, overwhelming awe that happens when an ordinary human being suddenly realizes they are standing in the presence of the divine. The veil between heaven and earth has just been pulled back on a dirt road in Galilee. The crowd does not just cheer. They do not just clap. They are gripped by a holy reverence, and they immediately shout two very specific things. First, they declare that a great prophet has arisen among them. This proves that the crowd understood the geography. They understood the history of the mountain they were standing on. They knew they were just over the ridge from Shunem. They knew the story of Elisha. By raising a widow's son on the exact same hill where the ancient prophet had done the same thing, Jesus had provided an undeniable sign. He was not just a teacher. He was not just a political revolutionary. He was stepping into the shoes of Elijah and Elisha, but operating with an authority that far exceeded theirs. The people recognized the ancient pattern, and they realized that the long silence of heaven was finally over. The prophetic voice had returned to Israel, but their second shout reveals something even deeper. They cry out, "God has visited his people." In modern English, the word visit sounds casual. We visit a friend for coffee. We visit a new city on vacation. It implies a temporary, low-stakes interaction. But the original Greek word used here is episkeptomai. It carries a massive theological weight. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, this word is used when God actively intervenes in human history to bring about a massive shift. When God remembered Sarah and gave her a child in her old age, Scripture says God visited her. When the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, crying out for deliverance. God told Moses that he had visited his people and seen their affliction. A divine visitation is not a polite drop-in. It is an invasion of grace. It means God has seen the suffering of his people. He has stepped into their reality, and he is about to change the outcome of the story. By saying that God has visited his people, the crowd at Nain is declaring that the ancient promises are waking up. The God who rescued them from slavery in Egypt is now walking among them, rescuing them from the ultimate slavery of death. They see the connection to the prophets of the past, but they also sense that something greater than a prophet is here. Elisha could only point to God. Jesus speaks with the voice of God. Elisha had to plead for the life of a single boy. Jesus commands life to return by his own authority. The shadow of the Old Testament prophets was real, and it was glorious. But a shadow is only cast by a greater substance. At the gate of Nain, the substance had finally arrived. The Old Covenant revealed the terrible strength of death. Jesus brings the total fulfillment of life. The echoes of the past have found their fulfillment. But this miracle at the gate of Nain points forward to a much larger collision yet to come. The story of the widow's son at Nain begins with two crowds colliding on a dirt road, the crowd of life and the crowd of death. They met at the narrow city gate, and one of them had to yield. For thousands of years, the answer was always the same. Life always yielded to death. Death had the ultimate right of way. But on that day, standing in the shadow of the ancient prophets, Jesus forced death to step aside. When we look closely at this moment, we realize that Jesus did not go to Nain just to perform a random act of kindness. He went there to make a theological declaration. By walking up the exact same mountain where Elisha had fought for the life of a child centuries earlier, Jesus was showing that the great, agonizing weight of the Old Testament was finally over. The shadow was giving way to the substance. Elisha was a servant in the house. Jesus is the builder of the house. Elisha had to ask for the power of God. Jesus spoke with the voice of God. But there is a deeper, more personal truth hidden in the dust of that road. When we face severe loss, when we walk behind our own funeral processions, our deepest instinct is often to ask God for comfort. We ask him to walk with us. We ask him to help us carry the weight of the grief. But the Jesus we meet at the gate of Nain does not merely offer comfort. He offers an interruption. He is not a distant, stoic observer of our pain. His compassion is visceral. It is gut-wrenching. He looks at the devastation of a broken world, and he is deeply, physically moved by it. And driven by that compassion, he steps directly into the path of our greatest enemy. He reaches out and touches what is unclean. He touches what is broken. He touches what is dead. And because he is the author of life, the contagion of death cannot hold him. His untouchable purity flows into the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. Yet, the miracle at Nain was not the final victory. The young man who sat up and spoke that day was given back to his mother. He lived out his days. He grew old, and eventually, the day came when he died again. The resurrection at Nain was temporary. It was a localized victory. It was a preview. Jesus stopped that procession to show the world what he was about to do on a cosmic scale. Just a short time later, Jesus would find himself outside the gates of another city, Jerusalem. And this time, he would not be the one stopping the procession. He would be the one carried in it. He would not just touch the wood of a burial stretcher. He would be nailed to the wood of a cross. He would not just risk the ritual impurity of touching a dead body. He would take the full, concentrated weight of human death upon himself. He would let the ultimate interruption happen to him. He descended into the deepest, darkest tomb of the human experience. But because he is the resurrection and the life, the grave could not hold him. 3 days later, he did not just sit up on a burial slab. He walked out of the tomb with an indestructible life. At Nain, Jesus pushed back the darkness for one family. In Jerusalem, he broke the spine of death forever. The collision at the gate of Nain was never just a random story. It was a deliberate, perfectly timed echo of the ancient prophets, designed to prove that the God who visits his people does not just mourn with them. he defeats their greatest enemy. The pattern was never just a pattern. It was the quiet architecture of redemption, pointing toward the day when every funeral procession will finally stop and death will be swallowed up in victory. If this journey through Scripture helped you see the text with fresh eyes, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next study. Thank you for walking through the Word with me.